All right, welcome back, everybody, to another Future Focus, where we are living at the land intersection of business technology and the human experience with the stated goal of keeping you 10 steps ahead. I am looking forward to today's conversation because if you follow any of my stuff, you know I talk a lot about technology, talk a lot about skills, and talk about a lot about where that's going. And there is a whole lot happening in that space, but really a lot of organizations are trying to figure out how do we use this to improve our employees, but also for employees to know, how do I get better at my job and how do I make myself viable in a state where AI can seem like a threat? And so hopefully this conversation will make technology feel less threatening and give both organizations and employees a good feeling about where they can go. I'm excited about it. So to join me in that conversation, I've got my friend Arjun Nagendran, and he's the founder of Relative AI. You've done some other things too. So Arjun, I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, Chris, thanks so much for having me on the show.
And I was so nervous about saying your name correctly. I did get it though, right?
You
I
got it
did,
right.
right?
You got it right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. I almost froze completely midstream
Yep.
on that one. So anyway, I'm looking forward to digging into this. And for those of you who are watching or listening, if you don't catch the whole thing, be sure to check out my Substack, where I will give the reflections on kind of some of the biggest takeaways. But before we get in, well, let's just jump right into it, Arjun. And for those who I've known you now for a while, even back from your immersion days and those things, but not everybody else has that benefit. So for folks who may not know who you are and kind of your background, how do you describe that when you bump into somebody at a barbecue?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I've been fortunate enough to have worked with a number of really great mentors and people that have kind of shaped my career. And really, the things that's driven me the most is, what are the kind of relationships that we've been able to build, and choosing the kinds of things that I want to work on based on, the people that are around me. And so it goes back all the way to my PhD days in Manchester, England. I got a PhD in robotics, worked on landing systems for unmanned air vehicles, transitioned into academia as a postdoc and a research associate professor. I was funded by the US Navy and the Gates Foundation, and it's kind of
Okay.
working at this intersection of virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and robotics.
Okay.
And one of the things we were trying to do at the time, this was about 10 years ago, when we had really heavy headsets kind of sitting on our, we had counterweights to kind of balance this out. And
Yeah. Yeah. Because they weren't as nice and comfy as they are today.
not at all. And, we had blue screens, and we had things that we were using. And the thing that got me interested in this aspect of human behavior was when I was working, in areas like Camp Pendleton, where we were trying to change or attempt to study human behavior using virtual reality simulations.
Okay.
And specifically, the Marines were trying to understand what it means to communicate cross-culturally
Okay.
in areas like Afghanistan. And so we developed a bunch of different things or technologies when AI was nowhere near as advanced as it is today, right? Back in the day, this was all about, the very basic natural language processing and some of that usual stuff that we used to
Yeah,
work
because
on.
we hadn't even, if you're talking 10 years ago, we weren't even into the deep learning space
No,
yet at that point.
no, not at all. And I think, at the time, there was a lot of emphasis on visuals back in the
Yep.
day. And for me, over the last, decade or so, I have started to see a fundamental shift in visuals being a part of it, but really a lot of it being auditory. And what I'm working on now, called Relative, is all about how do we use generative AI with specialized data and input and context from the data to try to analyze conversations at scale, and try to gain insights into sort of the human psychology and the linguistics, and whether we can start predicting outcomes based on how people converse with each other across different streams. So I'd love to dive into details with you.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring that up because as I think about, even just the shift in this, that I think has been really interesting about the progression of some of these AI models is it can in some ways almost seem like a step backwards because it's like, well, we're doing language. I mean, a lot of these language models you're interacting with similar to the way I was playing video games in the late 90s. It was like RPGs. And so it can seem like that, but it almost is like we missed how profound and valuable language was. And even from a visual standpoint, how even visuals oftentimes it has to do with our language and the way we interpret it and the way we communicate it and all these other things. So while the visual can play an element in it,
Yeah.
it's actually the underlying language that is the
Yeah.
differentiator for a lot of this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the number of times you're on a phone call, right? And you're calling customer service, and depending on how the person's responding to you, you're almost visualizing them. You're kind of
Yeah.
visualizing, are they seeming angry? Are they seeming pleasant? Is this likely to be a person I'd enjoy going out to coffee with? And the brain is subconsciously making those decisions, but that's all from audio. It's just listening in.
Yeah.
And so,
Well, which I
now,
think about creatives, I work with a lot of creatives and have played in the creative space myself a lot. But even as you think about creating visuals, you are in your head
yeah,
like you're verbalizing what you want to see. You may not be
absolutely.
saying it out loud, but essentially that's what's going on in your brain is you're actually taking words, you're taking your language and you're saying, now I need to do this. And you're converting it into image. It's not like the image itself is just creating,
That's
it's
right.
actually coming through the language.
That's right. That's right. And this is where it gets really exciting for me is like now that we have the AI models that are capable of really, in many ways, embedding large amounts of data internally, can we pick up on patterns, and can they pick up on patterns that we're not, picking up on, and then start to predict things like you probably should have done something slightly differently to steer that conversation.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, that area that is most exciting. And the every large language model that's coming out and the speed at which they're building now is just unbelievable. Just the amount of data that we're able to process through them, as long as we're able to provide context, which I think remains critical.
Yeah. Well, and on that one, so just kind of backing up a little bit in terms of the trajectory for you. Now, I do actually want to jump back a little bit. So you went into this, started with engineering, mechanical engineering and AI. Was your original trajectory like did you think you'd always stay in the tech space or was it always kind of this mix, of I like the tech but I actually like the convergence of it with people?
I mean, for me, I have been fascinated by the tech, but ultimately it would boil down to, am I having fun doing what I'm doing? And in some ways, it didn't matter what I was working on because I've worked on areas that include, financial modeling and
Yeah.
predict. It's crazy, but I would do it because I would enjoy working with those people, and that's what got me to start thinking about why is it that I'm attracted to certain areas of work? And I realized it's the human connection.
Okay.
It's the people that I work with. And if you think about the psychology of teams and why people stay in jobs and enjoy the jobs, I think we forget how much we enjoy working with people and each other, as opposed to saying, hey, I really want to go and do this particular subject. Because you could want to do something and have a bunch of people that aren't quite aligned, and you're no longer going to stay there.
Yeah. Well, and you see this a lot I mean, especially playing around the HR space like I do. You see this a lot even in employee engagement, satisfaction, like that kind of data, the dynamics of the team, the
Yeah.
relationships, the way they work together with each other
Yeah.
has far more of a compound effect on team effectiveness than, oh, are the projects in my list
Yeah.
something I really care deeply about? It's like that matters, yes. But honestly, I've seen people make shifts and go, I don't even really like the work I do, but I
Yeah.
love the people I work with.
Right.
And as a result, I
Yeah.
don't even really care that it's not necessarily something that's grabbing my attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the most part, we're we're a species that relies a lot on that social aspect and
We do.
human relationships, and you can't take that away from whatever your ultimate end goal is.
Which is why language is so profound.
Yes.
Because when you really think, even underneath relationships,
Yes.
it's all based on
Yeah.
language and
Yeah.
interpersonal communication and all of these things. I mean, again,
Yeah.
especially in the professional sphere, I
Right.
don't have physical relationships with people other than my wife, and
Yeah.
my kids, like type of a thing. So
Mhm.
for everybody else, the
Yeah.
relationship I have is built on
Yeah.
language. It's
Yeah.
built on the way I interact with them.
Yeah. And also, to that note, it's I think one of the things that we have to realize is every interaction that we have with another person is unique. And so you having a set of skills or repertoire that you can go back to in terms of your skills, the broader that it is, the better you're going to be at forming those relationships. Because the way you
Yep.
and I interact is going to be very different from the way I interact with somebody else.
Yeah.
And it boils down to language. It's how do I say things? When do I say them? And it's those kind of underlying patterns that people have got to start practicing and acquiring as skills if they want to be successful.
Yeah. Well, which is why it's interesting. And this kind of ties to the skill piece. You'll see people who, maybe they've said, like, I really want to improve my influencing skills or,
Yes.
whatever. It's one thing to have it in your head and know these are the things I'm supposed to do. But to your point, the way you interact with that person, you could be following the checklist of things and have a
Yes.
completely insignificant relationship because
Yeah.
you just don't really understand the nuances of how that plays
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. And I think there's a combination of, there's level one where there's certain norms that are accepted in society, and those are kind of what I call as like rule governed stuff or rule
Okay.
governed behaviors. And then there's the part about the outcomes, which is, well, what am I really trying to do at the end of this conversation? Sometimes it's open ended, you don't really have a goal. But if you think about, let's just say, a sales deal, right? You're about to close a big sales deal. You have your playbook and you've kind of gone through it. You know exactly how to handle objections. You need to know when to execute on parts of that playbook based on the responses you're receiving.
Yeah.
It's not like when you call somebody and complain, hey, my internet's broken, and they say, hey, good morning, I hope you're having a good day. That's not a great response because you already know that the person's calling.
Yeah. They're not having a good day. That's
No,
why they're calling you.
no. And so knowing, when to execute on those things, and being very reciprocative in some ways with
Yep.
language, I think matters a lot. And AI fortunately can start to learn from this data and help us get better at doing that. And I'd love to dive in a little deeper into all of that stuff as you're
Yeah.
thinking about.
Well, so as we go into this, because I think this really does set the table that hopefully people are starting to see if you don't think about this. I mean, I'm always profoundly mesmerized by how much data is actually in a conversation, even a single interaction with another person where you go back and forth for maybe
Yeah,
15 minutes,
yeah,
that we just on the surface don't even necessarily see. And I think that's where you start to see the skill disparities between people. Is some people are really good at picking up on, like you said, those contextual cues, and they can read these things and they know when to pivot and when to shift and how to do this based on, again, the purpose of the conversation. And then for other people, it's very difficult. But even from a human standpoint, there's just more data transactions happening than really any human could ever pick up on, period. And I think that's really what you're looking to tap into with relative, right? Is
yeah,
be able to say, yeah, but what if we could actually see that in
right.
some ways, like the matrix, almost the ones and zeros of this transaction? And then what can we mine out of that as insights that can help inform and influence our behaviors and skills in a way that actually drives better results?
Yeah. And I mean, it's really interesting you bring that up because I'm looking at the clock right now and we're at about 14 minutes. I'd be curious if we went back and, processed 14 minutes of data with relative, what the balance of time between you and me would be during the
Yeah.
speak. And my guess, because I've been paying so much attention to it and it's now subconsciously gotten ingrained, I'm probably at 60%. You're probably at about 40%. I can't be
Okay.
sure, but it's just worth an experiment. Because I
So
think
by
I've been
playing with
hogging.
these models, you're starting to pick up on like the balance of conversations.
Exactly. And then you can kind of correlate it to, let's just say at the end of the conversation you had the number of audience members that liked or enjoyed this episode.
Yep.
You know, and now you can go back and correlate, well, what were all of my shows like, and what was the balance of time in all my shows, and where were the ones where most people really enjoyed the show? Was it when there was a balance of like 45-55, or was it more like when there was a 30-70? And you can start to even just at the surface level
Yeah.
extract patterns that say that's what people really liked. And so you can
Interesting.
imagine extending this to different outcomes.
Well, I mean, yeah, I'm thinking about this, and this was why, as you got into it, and as as we got to know each other more, as you started going off on this venture, to me, this was a gold mine for organizations because all of these interactions are happening. I mean, literally, especially now when you think about the fact so many meetings, so many interactions are happening in virtual meeting environments like this, where everything's being channeled through a digital stream where that data is being captured already.
Yeah.
So to be able to actually take a look at that and start to assess, even like you said, on the surface level, what's the distribution of time speaking? But then, I mean, drill deeper into that. What were the different things that were being discussed? What were the kinds of questions asked? How did those questions receive? You start going into that and you can start unpacking just loads and loads of data.
Yeah, and just an early experiment about a year ago, we were able to pick up, patterns between, tutors and students that were indicative of the grades of the students, just by kind of
Really?
looking at, the exchanges and who spoke when and how much time did the tutor actually allow for the student to speak. Did they build on each other's ideas? And it's this sort of analysis that AI allows us to do, whereas back in the day, I mean, there were recordings. You probably never listened to them. How many hundreds of
Oh,
recordings do we have
I
stored?
mean, I think about, let's see, I was in a call center. I led learning for a call center. It was a while ago, but I remember we would record,
Yeah.
all the calls were recorded. And it was one of those things where you might spot check them,
Yes.
or if something bad happened,
Yes.
you'd go back and you'd listen to see what happened.
Yes.
Or maybe for, regular compliance or just development, you might listen to a few here and there. But it was literally impossible. We couldn't have had enough headcount to sit and listen to all those. And even if we could,
Yeah.
the processing power to analyze the patterns, identify the patterns, do all this, there was no human way possible anybody could ever do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, I think that that's a gold mine again. I mean, I can guarantee you, even from your listeners, right? There's probably hundreds of thousands of calls that they're sitting on that are just, you know, you're getting a bill because they're in storage, but you've never really extracted any kind of insights. And the real question now becomes, with the power of AI, what can you do with those calls to solve some of your biggest challenges today?
Yeah.
And there's a lot you can do. There's a lot.
Well, and on that, I think about this because having worked with a number of organizations, you run into these situations where, the business leader may have identified a problem and said, our close rate, we'll just use sales as an example. Our close rate isn't where we want it to be. We want that to increase. And they may go, this person over here, this group of people, they're closing at that rate or higher.
Yeah.
But oftentimes digging into, but why?
Why?
That many times that question is, the response to that is based off gut feel or assumptions or things like, well, I think so-and-so is really good, but it's not actually based on data.
No.
Because again, going back to who's listening to every single one of those things and actually then analyzing that through the lens of what is that?
Absolutely. It's funny you mentioned that, because in our very early days, and we continue to do this now, is as a sample, we were like, well, we have a few hundred sales calls and we've got this funnel where, we're not closing as many deals. What's going on? And when we ran our analysis on our own sales calls, it was pretty obvious that the playbook was getting really well executed. There was a lot of rapport building and all the usual stuff that needs to happen. The thing that we weren't paying attention to was the vertical and whether we were targeting the right prospects.
Okay.
And, for AI to surface that and say, you're doing
So you were
really
able,
well.
let me see if I can replay that back before you keep going on this. So by analyzing this, it wasn't necessarily, hey, the way the calls are happening is wrong. It's that the people that we're talking to, now that we can see the dynamic of the conversation, these aren't the right people to be having these conversations with. So we're spending a whole lot of time and energy on people that aren't the right people to be talking to.
That's exactly right. And so we just got more intelligent about prospecting in some ways from the data, because the data would tell us, hey, you're doing well, shift your strategy, see if you convert more. And it was really valuable insight, because otherwise, what would we have done with all those calls? Nothing. We would have just said, hey, well, let me take notes and get back to you. But it doesn't matter. You're talking to the wrong person. Or you would book another call, and now you're kind of looking at, well, why did we book another call when there was immediate signals in that first call that said that is not
This
the
isn't going to
person
go
that's going to,
anywhere.
it's not going to go anywhere.
Right.
And so just being a lot more efficient around that with the data is already, I mean, it's paying dividends right away.
Well, and I have to imagine too, on top of that, is the fact that, um, when you think about the intelligence behind how you then structure some of this stuff, it's about being able to use your resources more intelligently. And actually, I think from an employee experience standpoint, nobody wants to spend time on activity that is a waste of their time,
Right.
type of a
Right.
thing. So I just even think from an employee experience,
Yeah.
who wants to sit and spend a bunch of time on calls with people where you're like, this ain't going anywhere?
Right.
But
Yeah.
if you can know that ahead of time. And the other piece I was going to add that I think sometimes I've seen where, there can sometimes be resistance to this of like, oh, well, we don't need to see all that. But I think sometimes we have this bias towards looking too narrowly. Like, well, these
Yeah.
two experiences told this story, so that must be what it is.
Right.
And I get in the past, that's what we've had to do because, I mean, how many things could you really evaluate objectively? You really maybe only could look at 2 or 5 or 10.
Right.
But you're often leaving a whole lot of stuff on the table where you may be actually responding to data that's like, well, those two things are anomalies that actually could be
Right.
disregarded if you listen to 1,000 or 10,000
Exactly.
of the exact same calls.
Yeah. And that's the other power of having kind of volumetric analysis, or large amounts of data that can be analyzed in an instant, and you're getting more of a predictive insight that is based on patterns rather than spot checks and
Yeah.
yes, and just random sampling, essentially.
So with that, I am curious, because I look at some of these, I want to talk about specialized AI because even at the end of, I was probably mid 2023, I was watching what was going on with these large language models, and I'm like thoroughly impressed. Don't get me, I mean, I think some of these ones, especially some of the stuff coming out, they're fantastic, but I still feel like some of the gaps in them is that they're based on all the information of
Yeah.
the internet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which the law of averages, it's going to come back and go, well, okay, I'm going to give you an answer based on what everything would tell me, where there is a lot of nuance and
Yeah.
discrepancy that you have to kind of account for in a business where you might go, yeah, maybe that makes sense in this industry or in this sphere or these kinds of things, but that may not make sense for this. So how now are what you're doing, how are you kind of specializing or zoning in on that? Because I do think that's one of the biggest opportunities I see with these big models.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, what you get out of them,
Yeah.
it's definitely wildly better than, a person trying to do things on their own. Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is still largely the most generic version of whatever everything out there would have to say.
Yeah. And I love that, you're focused on this aspect, because I have seen so much, social media now in the community that says, we're going to use ChatGPT or GPT 4.0 to solve all of these problems. And there's like talk about, ultimately they'll kind of drive all of the other smaller businesses out of, like, their comfort zone, or out of, like, or replace. But I don't think people quite understand that the models are getting really good, but that just means the infrastructure is getting really good. The
Yeah.
models themselves, the best use of those so if you want generic advice around, I have this particular issue, how am I going to solve it, you're going to get an amalgamation, which is an average of every other person that has solved that problem that way. And theory of averages will say, yeah, that's probably a good enough answer,
Right.
right? And for you as a business, though, that might never be your strategy, and you might need specific advice from these models on what is going on with your specific vertical. The way that we look at this at Relative is we leverage the greatest advances of all the models, because ultimately that infrastructure is what is giving us the basic bones on which we build. But we
Yeah.
never engage with a client unless they say, we have data and we have guidance and we know the problem that we're trying to solve, and here's how we want to solve it.
Okay.
So we then take that data and we
What's really
create.
funny before you go into that
Uh-huh.
is what you just described right there of taking the time to identify we have the data, and we know what problem we're trying to solve, I think is actually one of the biggest gaps right now, which is why there is still a lot of allure to the big models.
Yes.
Because if you don't have that, it can really blow your mind.
Right.
Like if you're just kind of throwing darts in the air,
Right.
the big models will shock you because you'll go, wow, like look at that. But if you actually look at what it gives you and you have a very specific thing that you're trying to solve,
Yeah.
and a very specific set of data that you're trying to solve it for.
Yeah.
I mean, I just even know personally when I haven't analyzed stuff for me, a lot of times I'm like, yeah, I mean, that was okay. That's like what I would expect if I had an intern working for me.
Right.
You know, a really good intern,
Exactly.
it'd tell me that. And I'd be like, oh, okay, fine.
Exactly.
It's not bad, but it
Right.
really actually does not get that level of high tier.
I mean,
Okay,
every
that is a unique
organization
feature.
using these models is going to get the same advice that you do.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then what's your competitive advantage, right? I mean, if they're all getting it, like why are we using it? You might as well level the playing field. Or we'll all up, all kind of move up at the same. If you want a true advantage that says, I'm going to be thoughtful about this. Here's what I want to solve for. Here's what's historically happened. We can help find a way to help these larger language models understand how to unpack
Yes.
that data and provide you advice that's really personalized.
Well, and what you're describing, and I think this is the difference. And I see there's room for both. That's the whole thing. And they work together honestly in pair well. But I see a lot of the big models being good for lifting the bottom.
Yeah.
You know, it's good for like, hey, if you're struggling or there's these areas where you just have no infrastructure or people, it can get you up to average, but that's about as high as it's ever going to lift. So if you're looking to lift the bottom,
Yes.
it can be helpful with that. But to your point, is it ever going to separate you from the pack?
Yeah.
Not really, because it's like, well, it's just going to bring you up to the middle.
That's right.
Which is great if you're trying to raise the bottom, but it's not going to help you if you're going, yeah, but now we need to go above and beyond.
Absolutely. And I'd encourage everybody, if they haven't already done so, like play around with the models, right? Like use it to learn the capabilities. And then when the time is right, let's start looking at specific data streams and specific problems and figuring out how we can mold those models to give you that data that you need or that advice that you need.
Okay. So as you look at what you're doing, and I'm curious how you're splitting your attention on this, because I actually see there's room for both in here, but I'm curious where your priorities lie on it.
Mm-hmm.
Is in one sense, we talked about how all of this conversational data that every organization is sitting on has loads of data. Now, there's two paths you could go with it. You could go with it down the path of like business analysis, try and identify better solutions to your problems, improve your strategies, improve your strategy execution, stuff like that. You also could specialize and go down the path of develop your people, grow the skills of your people, all this other. I don't think they're necessarily in competition with one another, but how do you see those two merging?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what one of the first things we ask, people that we're working with is, what is the overarching kind of issue and what is the kind of needle it would move for your business? And some people come to us and says, hey, we really want to develop, the camaraderie and cohesiveness of our workforce so that they're all working together.
Okay.
And others come to us and say, hey, this is more of a strategic AI play. We think, there's a large amount of insights that we can glean from some of our data. And perhaps that'll tell us where we want to focus our specific efforts.
Okay.
The thing that we're always very conscious about doing is making sure that the people that we work with are willing and able to run experiments with us with their data. It's anonymized, right? And we want to make sure that we're learning patterns and things like that that we see in the data without ever sacrificing any kind of privacy for anybody.
Okay.
And then during that test run, we set a couple of goals. We say, here's what the problem is, here's what we are expecting as insights from the AI model. And once we've run a pilot through, we sit down and actually get them to take the time to go back and evaluate the AI.
Okay.
Because it's got to be a closed feedback loop. And people always ask me, well, what about bias? And is there bias in the AI and so on?
Of
And
course there is.
but
There's bias in everything.
I mean, there's bias everywhere. It's a question of, what kind of bias is it? Is it preferential bias? Because if preferential bias isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's something that you need for the business to work. It's whether or
Yeah.
not you've got that unconscious, subconscious bias that is potentially, putting a bunch of people at risk. And
Yeah.
um, the models themselves are not going to have, if you feed the data the right way, they're not going to have any knowledge about whether or not they're discriminating. What they're doing is just, like I said before,
I think that's
discovery.
one of the things that's really interesting about the whole bias
Yeah,
question is that it's like it's just looking at the information.
that's right.
I think one of the things that can be sometimes a hard pill to swallow
Yeah.
is it's like looking in the mirror. You
Yes,
don't necessarily always like seeing
that's right.
back the reflection. You're kind of like, "Ooh, that's kind of like ugly." And you're like,
That's right.
"Yeah."
That's
Like
right.
that's what's going on in the data because that's
Yeah.
what's going on in your organization. It just
Yeah.
happens to be revealing it to you.
Absolutely. And I think the most important piece here with all of our people that are, I call as early adopters or innovators that are in it for the long haul, which is they're investing their time and effort now so that in a year from now or 2 years from now they're going to have that competitive advantage because they've understood what the models are doing with their data.
Yeah.
The thing that I realize with them is they're willing to put in that work. They say, let's run the pilot. We'll come back. We'll give you feedback. Let's look at the differences between how we would have evaluated this versus how the AI would have done it. Let's try to figure out why that difference exists. And sometimes it surfaces bias on the human side,
Okay.
and which is really interesting, right? And so, like for instance, we sometimes use we have a bunch of people in the recruiting space using the AI to try to understand how people communicate
Okay.
during an interview. And then we have scoring metrics, and we kind of go back and say to a recruiter, well, you scored this person really high, but the AI seems to suggest that they shouldn't be scored quite as a high. And then you realize that there was a human connection that involved a certain movie or something that they talked about, and they're like, I actually liked that person a lot when I first met them, so I ignored these red flags. you know I'm
Yeah.
like, well, that's a bias. And so it's very interesting. And I think we're just going to keep learning more as these models evolve. And the organizations that will learn are the ones that are experimenting.
Okay. Okay. Well, and that's so my next question for you related to this, because I was curious where we're at in the maturity curve. Because while I see a lot of hype around AI and everybody's talking about, the AI thing and what we're doing with AI, when I actually dig underneath the surface a little bit, I find a lot of organizations really are still struggling to kind of get their footing on where do we start with it. And in some ways, even the ones I've encountered who may be a little bit out of the gate and running down the track, they haven't done what you described at the beginning, which is say, yeah, but what problem are you trying to solve and what data are you going to analyze to try and solve it?
Yeah.
And so they can find themselves going, I'm not necessarily seeing a whole lot of value out of what we're doing. And it's like, well, yeah, naturally. So I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of like organizational readiness for some of this. Cause I know some orgs just the thought of it just freaks them out. Some
Yeah.
are ready to go, but what's that split look like?
It's really interesting. I recently read something on LinkedIn where an organization had spent, six-figure numbers on a company that they wanted to use the AI for evaluation or
Okay.
assessment, and they concluded, within a couple of months that the AI was not good enough for evaluation.
Okay.
That for me raises a number of flags, right? Which is first of all, 2 months is, or 3 months, even if it's 6 months, it's insufficient time for you to make a conclusion of that nature, because in those 6 months the models have probably evolved 6 times over, right? And so whatever you evaluated is probably already obsolete. And so now the question really becomes, did they put an end to that experiment because they just made that conclusion? And so the thing that I would like to reiterate is we treat this as a journey,
Okay.
and that when we're doing this is an investment. Like, we think of this as an R&D expense or a marketing expense, or however you want to think about this, as saying, this is part of my organization's AI strategy, because I know that 3 years from now, people that have the insights to utilize AI across their business functions are going to be far ahead of everybody else on the curve.
Yeah.
And so if you don't invest in those experiments now and be a little bit more open about, well, that wasn't a conclusion, that was more of a finding, and here's what we're going to do when we run it with the next model, you're not going to get the results that you want.
Okay.
So, going back to your question around, how do people decide whether or not something is effective? My suggestion again is pick a problem, define how you as humans would evaluate problem. Because if you think of what AI is going to do, it's going to learn from you and then it's going to amplify the, I mean, think of it as you times 100 now being
Yeah.
available. And as long
That's,
as
I
you,
think, one of the biggest risks with it right now is
that's
that
right,
if you go charging into this without a plan,
that's right,
it's going to make a mess
that's right. And so
a heck
you
of a
times
lot
100
faster.
could really be bad if you do the wrong thing with it.
Yeah.
And so, making sure that you're thoughtful about the problem you're solving, making sure that your end users that you're targeting for that problem solve also have buy-in. So, like,
Okay.
don't go force a usage of an AI on an organization. Ask the organization where they want to be met. What are they struggling with? And then inform the strategy for the use of AI. I think matters a lot in the long run.
Okay. Well, and so two things, and then we can kind of, I want to kind of explore a little bit deeper on here, but I think this is really sage wisdom, I think, for a lot of organizations. I know a lot of senior business leaders are kind of in this state where they're like, we don't really know what to do right now. And I know there are some assumptions that like, oh, well, we'll just wait for like our big enterprise systems to have this kind of stuff, which I actually think is a mistake, going back to the law of averages, where it's like, well, they're just going to pull in
Yeah.
the average stuff that you're trying to do. But I think
Yeah.
now really is, which seems counterintuitive with the pace that things are moving right now. But I talk a lot about the power of the pause right now and how important it is to
Yeah.
go, now is the time to stop
Yeah.
and actually think, what is it we're really trying to do here?
Yeah.
And how do we know that that's the right thing? And what can we be doing to validate and assess that so that we can then apply AI to maybe help us figure that out so that we can be faster to move on that? And it
Yeah.
sounds like that's really the role you're taking the AI that you're pursuing right now and that you're building to do, is to really be that almost supplement or augmentation to an organization. Because I think that's another challenge a lot of organizations are doing, is they're going, well, do we need to build our own
Yeah.
internal AI strategy? And I don't think people realize how much work.
That's a lot of work.
It's a lot of
Yes.
work. People see like, oh, ChatGPT is so easy, we'll
Yeah.
just do one ourselves internally. And I don't think people realize the
No.
trillions of dollars that have been spent to get that to where it is. So to just try and go rebuild that yourself for your own organization, it's just
No.
not sustainable.
No, and I think, and I love that you, again, this is something that I would love for organizations and people to understand is it, building an AI strategy is cumbersome and
It's super
like
cumbersome,
really cumbersome.
like
And
really hard.
it starts with data,
Yes.
and it starts with structured data, which is even harder, which means
Yes.
that you might have all that data sitting around. It's still not quite structured in the way that the AI systems are used to consuming it.
Yeah.
And so the
Yeah,
sheer
there is this perception that we can just take all this stuff and throw it at AI
no,
and it'll make sense of it. And it's
no,
like, that's not how it works.
no. Yeah, it's definitely not a magic wand. And it's getting from that unstructured data to, getting the AI to make meaning out of it and then give you meaningful results, that I think is, one of the biggest challenges and hurdles. It's never too late to start, right? Which is, if you don't have a lot of unstructured data or structured data, you can start putting them in place now, which is why organizations experimenting with this stuff that say, hey, you know what? We've got hundreds of sales calls that occurred last week, right? It's just 1 week worth of data. What can we do with it? Because here's what's happening. We've had hundreds of sales calls. We only have 3 meetings that have been booked, for the next week. Why? How do we convert, that from having hundreds of sales calls to having, let's say, 10 meetings booked, and it's identifying that problem and saying, you know what, we're going to solve last week's problem. and see how good AI is at at solving that particular problem, and then go from there to say, well, how much further back can we expand historically, or how much into the future can we start looking into based on how
Yeah.
this particular thing works. So treat it in small chunks, pick small data sets, test the AI systems. The thing with ChatGPT that I'll tell you again is it's great for individual use, but you as an organization, even if you let it loose across your entire org, you have no idea what people are doing with it. And
Yeah.
that's not giving you enough information about the organizational context to say this is useful. It will definitely help with independent workflows. It won't help
Yeah.
you move, your result as a
Well, and I
business.
think that's why we've seen some of the ceiling of the logarithmic curve start to come into play, because it's kind of like, well, individuals are starting to figure out, hey, these are
Yeah,
the things I do, and here's how I can use it to help me get this kind of stuff done. But from an enterprise,
yeah,
how does this change the way enterprise workflows or enterprise strategy works? It's really not there. And I think we're seeing it kind of flatten out a bit, because
yeah,
it is very difficult to go from this to that.
yeah, absolutely. And I think the more that we think about the automation pieces that AI is offering, with things being built into the Google Drive now, for instance, and Gemini's out and all of this stuff, there is no doubt that those will have an immediate impact. The workflow based AI
For
tools, right?
sure.
You can start using them individually. What will matter the most is how do each of us that is now moving at 10x the speed because we have AI start to collaborate with each other. Because you, Chris,
Yeah.
are running your experiments with your AI tools. You've gotten results that would have taken you 10 days in half a day now. I've done the same with half a day. Now, the way that we communicate our concepts and the cadence of our meetings is going to change because of these AI tools.
Yep.
And what matters the most is, are you working on the same sorts of things that I'm working on? What's the overlap? What's our strategy? We've just condensed our timelines. And now, if there's 15 of us on a team, what are we all doing with the increased speed that we've just gotten with our AI workflows? And that's where it starts to get into this people skills kind of space, because it will become so important that teams start to communicate and build that trust and empathy across people to
Yeah.
make the organization move forward.
Well, and what you just brought up there, I think, is one of the unanticipated risks organizations are not taking into account with these large scale AI enterprise implementations, is giving people the tools to make them be able to do the job of 100 people in theory. When you talk to a lot of big organizations, one of the biggest problems they have is duplication
Yep,
and silos, fragmentation, all this
absolutely.
other stuff, because people are off running their own pathways, not connecting. And I actually think this is one of the biggest risks organizations have coming in the near future, is people are going to go, well, now I really don't need to collaborate
That's right.
because I've got this AI assistant that's
That's right.
helping me do all this stuff. Why do I need to go talk to Bill in finance or work with the strategy
That's
team on this?
exactly right.
I'll just ask, Jasper, my AI agent, to help me pull it together with
That's
my
right.
own team. And I can almost run like an independent company,
That's right.
which feels good to you as a team, but it's terrible for
Yes.
organizational
Yes.
performance. It's just
Yes.
an absolute tragedy for organizational performance. And this is a risk I think a
Yeah.
lot of organizations are not considering.
Absolutely. I love that perspective, and to think about it in that manner is you've increased capacity, but you haven't really thought about, how do we fuse that capacity as an organization is a huge risk. And I love that perspective.
Well, and I think what that does, because, as I've gotten to know you and what you're doing with this, I think sometimes people look at, these big AI models and they say, oh, this, it's going to take away all the work of this, or it's going to do all this for us, type of a thing. But I even think about what we just described. Okay. So let's say you are an organization, you're an early adopter, even if you're fully integrating some of these big AI models to do some of your workflows and things like that, you still are going to need something that then can look at, how is this working now today? And where
Yeah.
is there room for improvements on this? Because, to the example we just gave, well, now we've got 37 silos and all these
Yeah.
things happening. And but why? Why is that happening? Or what opportunities do we have? Because you can't just say, well, stop doing that and magically it goes away. But you're also going to have a difficult time trying to actually coordinate that across all of your internal data. You're going to need that specialized AI that you can come in and go, we got 37 silos and we got to figure out how much duplication is going on here and where can we consolidate and which consolidations make sense and which ones don't. And the only way now, because now you've involved AI in the first half, you've created exponentially more data. You actually need the AI to solve the AI problems that it created, because there's no way human capacity could even allow you to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a compounding kind of loop, you know, and
right. Which is why when I hear people go, oh, these big ones are going to come in and there's not going to be room for anybody else, I'm like, no, because we've seen that in other parts of the tech ecosphere. Where people have gone, oh, our HRIS will solve all our HR problems.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, it's funny. I do hear the same thing. And the question that I kind of throw back at many of these people is the big companies are not going to attempt to solve the problems of a boutique firm or, you know, a small shop. They're given their whole, and the fact that we think they're going to do something, I think is misplaced just because they have the capability.
Right. Just because they could doesn't mean they will, because it doesn't make commercial viable sense.
Doesn't make any sense for them, right? And at the end of the day, like, they're giving us the best possible tools, and I'm thankful to all the Microsofts and OpenAIs and Googles of the world for
doing the trillions of dollars of research and everything that was needed to get it across the finish line.
That's exactly right. And they've given us the best tools, and they're saying, and this is the reason they have all these funds, is like, go make an impact and use your data to scale your businesses. And without that, just relying on them or waiting for them to say they're going to release something that's going to, you know, eventually overthrow something else, it's just the wrong approach.
No, I completely agree. And again, I think anybody who's listening goes, I just don't know about that. Look at other tech ecosystem challenges that have spawned up, where every function I've known has said, oh, this big monstrosity app, you're never going to need another app. Sales, if you have Salesforce, you won't need anything else. Wrong. No. You know, if you have Workday, you won't need any other HR apps. Wrong. Because what happens is these big players, to your point, it's not commercially viable for them to specialize in anything.
That's right.
They need to be able to do the 50% across the board and have as many people on it, but it leaves a huge gap, and they have there's no incentive for them to want to drill deep.
That's right. I mean, it's back to the thing you mentioned about the models being the average, right? And it's the same with the tools and the power plays. Like, the features within a Salesforce or a Workday are going to be the average of what everybody's asking for.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they're going to solve every little function that you require. And it's the same with the models. Is you pick your problem, and you might have a niche area that you need some help with, and you can reap huge ROI by solving that problem.
Yes.
The model's not going to let you do that unless you're thoughtful about how we do it.
No. And I think that's where they will and this is where I've talked to some AI companies where they're trying to recreate their own type of open AI. And I'm like, well, to me, that's not a wise endeavor, because you're never going to be able to recreate the core. But I think, like what you're describing, where you go, yeah, we're taking the core, the infrastructure, and then now layering on a specialty layer on top, which allows us to take the benefit of the big player, but then specialize in, which we really haven't had that in the past, because historically in technology, you did have to keep things very disconnected. So it's actually a pretty unique state we're in with AI.
Yeah. And they've done, I mean, if anything, you know, the big companies are doing everything they can to save the hassle of other people having to build, you know, the models from scratch, right? I mean, and that's where they're going to focus most of their efforts, is they're going to eventually have this run on device, you know, at the edge. And now you can start doing computations at the edge. But if you as an organization are not thinking about, well, if people are doing this on their mobile phones and each of them is using it, how do we look at the aggregated data towards driving a business outcome?
Yep.
You've just lost out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what we're going to see. And we're already seeing this. I mean, the number of organizations who are Microsoft or Google shops, where if you actually dig into it and go, you've got more data than you know what to do with. What are you doing with it? many of them are like nothing.
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
Right.
Because and they may even have access to some of the tools, but they just really, to build the specialty skills of knowing what to do with it. And I think that's probably going back to, as organizations, for those listening to this, trying to think what should be our organizational strategy. I actually think this is one of those areas where you go, well, it's actually a partnership. Like,
Yes.
you're looking at this going, our AI strategy is to say, we're going to be super focused on identifying the problems, knowing the data and the context that we have in our organization. And our AI strategy is to find the right partner who specializes in how do you tweak and twist and mold the AI model to get the most out of it. And then you partner that, building that internally.
Yeah.
Honestly, there are very few organizations that I think that's a scalable or wise path to take.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's I can't even begin to explain just the sheer amount of infrastructure and expenses and the ongoing maintenance and all of the other problems that you'll start to face if you start to go down that road of like, let's go build this capability ourselves. Because the biggest mistakes that organizations can make is shifting their core value proposition from being what it is right now to saying, hey, we're going to be an AI company. No, you don't want to do that. You want to stick
and
to
we've
the core
seen
value.
this shift with companies who have said, and I've seen this mistake happen. Again, the wisdom of King Solomon, nothing is new under the sun. But we saw this with companies that went, well, we're no longer we're a digital company.
Yeah.
And the way they applied that was they shifted all their focus off what their core business was to trying to set up their own technical infrastructure.
Yes.
And they completely collapsed in on themselves because they didn't realize it was like, no, you should have found a good partner be that technical infrastructure to support what you were doing. You should have never tried to become a digital company. And I think the same is true with AI.
Yeah. And I'll reiterate for those I've heard concerns about, well, if we don't build it ourselves, it's not our IP. But that is absolutely the wrong way of thinking about it in this age, because the IP is in your data. The data is going to be your IP. Your business knowledge is going to become your IP, because you're not going to build an AI model or a machine learning or a deep learning model that's your IP that's going to compete with the big guys.
No.
At the end of the day, it's whether you have enough business context on a problem and know how to structure it so that small model that you're building based on the other bones, now that is what you're really focusing your core value proposition around.
Right. Well, and it's funny you talk about the concerns, and I understand them. I understand from business sides where there are concerns about, well, what's happening with the data and all some of these things. But one of the things that I think is interesting about it, I mean, one, not only do you go through long process to sign lots of legal paperwork in terms of all this stuff, in terms of data protection and all this stuff. So first of all, this isn't the first time we've had to deal with data. We went through the same shift when SaaS became a thing. And everybody was paranoid about, well, where's the data sit? And oh my gosh, what's happening with it? And I think we're going through that phase again, where it's like, oh my gosh, we don't want to give our data over to these AI partners because what might happen with it? And aren't they just going to go recreate our business and put us out? And it's like, well, no, just like SaaS didn't do that either, because it wasn't a sustainable business model.
Right.
But I think going back to something we've been talking about through the whole thing is, even some of these organizations, and I even see this with some of the lawsuits happening in the media sphere right now, where people go, well, but that's our IP, and now it's involved in training these. What I think some people sometimes miss is, once it gets thrown into that machine and you're pulled away from the context and the specialization, that data just goes back into the law of averages and floats into this sphere of it actually has no power anymore, because it's just meaningless information that's sitting over there that without the context, it's just going to get lost in the sea of information. And I think sometimes people are like, yeah, but if it's over there, it's going to tell our competitor how to run like we do. And it's like, no, it's not. It's going to end up giving it a bunch of, so even in the risks, and I think some of the worst case doomsday scenarios people play out in this,
Yeah.
my interpretation of it is it's far less of a risk than people realize. It's just we're in
Oh,
this new
absolutely.
stage where it's unfamiliar.
Yeah, you know, the bigger, I mean, the media obviously exasperates this, right? They exaggerate the trend. I mean, you
You
can't
don't
contain it.
say.
And
The
so,
media
right.
makes these things
Oh my
bigger than they
goodness,
are.
it's just and it's part of it is public perception is one of the
Yes.
biggest threats to innovation, right? And all we can do in the media nowadays is, hey, there's a risk, there's a risk, there's a risk, without really trying to understand what's going on the inside.
Yeah.
And the thing you mentioned about the the risks, if anything, I was on my phone the other day, and um, we were talking about a vacation to a certain location, and about 3 minutes later, there was an ad on my phone
Yep.
with that location, and it was a really unique location, right? It wasn't like, hey, this is like one of those sought after location, and um, it's those kind of, I mean, we, because we're pretty technical around like the house, and we're trying to
Yeah.
figure out, like, did someone search for this location on any of their devices? Was it searched for in the last 7 days? Like, who could have put in that information? Because I know targeted advertisements, but it's that kind of thing that actually worries me more than, when you feed your data into a closed AI model that is secure, and you've been thoughtful about how you feed that data to get the insights,
Yes.
versus, like, you're just publicly talking about stuff, and the next thing you know, there's an ad on there with the vacation home.
Well, and I think this, I completely agree with you, because I think this is where the merging of people's concerns, and people don't realize it's like we're talking about two very different situations. In one situation, we're partnering with an AI group who, in a closed system, we're looking at this and we're saying, how do we analyze this and how do we, figure this stuff out? On the consumer side, and I think this is one of the concerns I have with 4.0 came out and Google's announced with really the real time, you can talk to it like an assistant. And I was
Yeah.
playing around with it with my kids.
Right.
And as I'm thinking through this, I'm like, I'm literally authorizing this thing to listen to everything going on in my
That's right.
house when I say, hey, I'm engaging with you. I'm
That's right.
consenting to
That-
take in whatever is going on. And to your point, I think those are legitimate things we should be thoughtful and discerning of like,
That's right.
well, okay, when and how is it? But that's very different than we have a closed set of data we
Yes.
want to analyze, we want to do for business purposes and
Yes.
try and solve a problem.
Absolutely. 100%. And I would love for readers and listeners to kind of know the difference and start to distinguish between true privacy concerns and concerns around the privacy and security and anonymity of their data in a business context. Because
Right.
if you're that worried, you will not reap the benefits that AI has to offer you,
No, you will
right?
not.
And that's okay. That's just a conscious choice that you make.
It
But
may
just know
significantly impact your business
it will
success,
impact your
but
business decision, but sadly, your personal privacy is going to be invaded no matter what. So,
yeah.
and that's what I would urge people to think about.
Well, and I think this goes back to the risk appetite, and it's part of why I do this show. So, I'm so passionate about is helping people understand what they're dealing with, because
Yeah.
there's lots of boogeyman that aren't really boogeyman.
No.
And then I see lots of other things that I go, holy crap, this is serious. And everybody's like, what's the big deal? And
Yeah.
I think helping people understand how these things work
Right.
can help them start to have a risk appetite for this. Because I mean, even the example that you give now, I mean, when you think about in your organization, the amount of data that is being captured in what you're doing anyway, that again, you're just not necessarily thinking about it. And I think this is where organizations are going to have to walk this carefully.
Yeah.
But to your point, there's a big difference between ChatGPT
Yes.
literally being invited to turn on your camera and open your
Yes.
microphone and listen to and see everything that's going on in your life,
That's right.
and trying to solve a very specific business problem with a closed AI model.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Okay. Well, I literally feel like I could talk to you about this for another several hours, but we're at 59 minutes.
Yep. What do you think the distribution is, like 40?
Yeah.
40?
Yeah, I know. Now this whole conversation, I've been sitting there going, Arjun is sitting there calculating like, oh, I think Christopher's been talking this much and I've been talking this much. But Last question for you
Yeah.
is for folks who are starting to maybe want to be an early adopter in this and go, I don't want to be a laggard because I recognize things are changing, but I may be a little bit uncertain and I'm not sure where to start.
Yeah.
What is your advice to those folks in terms of where should they start?
Yeah. I mean, the fascinating thing for me over the last, year or maybe like year or so playing around with these kind of models is I've been at the heart of trying to understand what are they good at and why they're good at it.
Okay.
And the takeaway for me has been that um, the with every iteration of the model that's coming out, they're getting so much better at understanding the relationship between words.
Yep.
And when I say understanding, I don't mean conceptually understanding it. I just mean the mathematical models or the underlying black box that the AI is
Yeah.
building is better. And which
Yep.
means that given data in the right format, the outputs from these AI models are a lot closer to what you would have expected if you had an expert coach.
Yep.
And so uh, having understood that, what I would ask organizations to think about is this. Think about this from the context of the problems that you currently need to solve, let's just say in either sales or client success, or even within project management and so on and so forth.
Oh yeah. I
You
think
want to
marketing. I mean, I
or
can't think of a
marketing. You
function
think
where you
think of
don't you
any
don't have data.
function where there's
Yep.
a group of people working as a team. You probably have recorded calls or data around how those meetings went or what was discussed in those meetings. Use the AI to kind of extract insights and create you know micro modules that will allow you to go back and replay them in a manner that lets you learn, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I've found really successful is like like our sales calls. The AI has already learned all the objections that we've ever seen in the field
Okay.
just from analyzing the calls. It knows what objections we hear. And now on a daily basis, I can log in for 5 minutes. It'll throw me 5 objections that it's
Okay.
seen from last week. And
Okay.
I can say either I've know how to overcome that objection, or I'm like, wow, that's a new one. I didn't think about that one.
Okay.
And so um, using it to real time learn from your data the kinds of things or challenges that your people are facing is one
Okay.
really really good way to use the system. I've also deliberately started having us do some philanthropic work around like education, because I believe that
Okay.
our younger generations are going to be very very exposed to these technologies. um, the thing that we don't teach them is the transitionary part from schools to the workplace
Yeah.
and it's a different set of skills because you learn theoretically what you want to do, but you don't know how to communicate with a bunch of other people,
Yep.
and using the AI to help them learn those human skills from
Okay.
the grassroots stage, whether high school or colleges or college admissions and preparation, and those kind of areas are extremely effective as long as the organization is one that's willing to invest the time and effort to say, here's how I would guide these students, because the
Okay.
demographics are different, right?
Yep.
And so again, it's customized data, providing insights to the AI on how to guide or how to coach, not just saying go use ChatGPT to put in a job description and get a CV out of it. That's not helpful.
Yeah.
Um, and so, either in a business context or an academic context, guide the AI into giving you the advice, and
Okay.
then you scale your impact 100-fold.
Okay. So I think, in summary, how I would play that one back is now is the time to be thinking about what are those real pain points?
That's
Like,
right.
what are those pain points that either your employee, because I know I've got academic and business leaders who listen to this. What are your pain points with your employees or your students? Like, where are they getting stuck? And then now is also, I would think this would be a safe bet, a good time to assess what data do we have that we can look at that would give us insights into it.
That's
And
right.
identifying those two things
That's right.
then sets you up to say, now, how do we find someone, or how do we actually find the technology to look at that and help us gain some insights from that?
That,
And
that,
really,
that,
that going back to the best place to start is figure out where are the pain points and what data do we have? Because I know for a fact there are times you go, this is a pain point, you dig into it and you go, we don't really have any data
That's right.
on that. And you might discover that.
That's right. And the good news again is we can work with small amounts of, like a week's worth of data is sufficient for you to start playing
Yeah.
with these models.
That's
And
I think the other thing that's fantastic is,
yeah,
you don't need, I think there are orgs that go, well, we would have to have years worth of data. And I actually would go, no, actually, you may
no,
not even want to
yeah,
go too far back, because then you might just dilute the model just like you would if you're using one of the
that's
big
right.
large language models. You may want to look at the last quarter or week,
That's right.
like you said.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And the other thing I'll say is the y- we've all heard the term, like, process is broken, or fundamentally the org moves really slowly, but they're all a function of people skills at the end of the
Yes.
day. And to the extent to which you have data that involves human communication, that's a gold mine, because
Okay.
AI can help you derive insights for those and give you practice environments within which you can learn those skills.
Okay.
And there's nothing better than learning on the task rather than at
Yeah.
some
And on a
mandatory module.
hypothetical.
So that's right, exactly. It's not
Yep.
hypothetical. That's right.
Okay. Awesome. Well,
Amazing.
Arjun, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I hope this has kind of helped people think just differently about how they may be thinking about their AI strategy and what they can do with it, and how you probably have a lot more available to you than you realize if you
That's
take the
right.
time to really distill down what your problem is and what data you have around it. So thank you so much for joining me. I'll have you
Likewise.
back for sure. We'll
Yeah.
have another one of these conversations down the road. And so thanks everybody for watching and
Yeah.
listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and we will see you on the other side.
Thanks again, Chris. That was amazing.